What if the most dangerous part of modern espionage isn't the explosion or the car chase, but the deep, insidious system that makes the very idea of genuine, stable loyalty feel like, well, like an irrational luxury? We are diving into a book that's far less about saving the world and much more about fundamentally flawed people navigating these massive systems, both American and Russian, built on cold coercion and, frankly, manufactured truth. Enjoy a bold new take on book coverage with this extended analysis. This is more than just a summary, which we absolutely include. This feature examines how the author shapes his argument, builds influence, and ultimately earns, or potentially loses, your trust. We really aim to give you the tools to read with sharper insight. And if you're an aspiring writer, understanding this structural breakdown is just gold. Should you read this book, this should absolutely help you decide. And truly, if you find this format valuable, we'd love to hear from you. Your feedback really does guide our future content.
And you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook, LM, for deeper, more dynamic book analysis. The title we're exploring is David McCloskey's Moscow X, a contemporary espionage thriller that has really captured a lot of attention.
And the situation surrounding this book, the author's background, is crucial to understanding its impact.
Yes, absolutely. The author, David McCloskey, is a former CIA analyst. He spent years briefing senior U.S. officials on intelligence matters. So that background immediately grants him this powerful ethos on intelligence culture, on tradecraft.
It's not just a writer imagining the spy world.
No, not at all. It's an insider delivering commentary.
So it positions the novel as both gripping entertainment and, maybe more importantly, a kind of critique of how modern espionage really works. Or maybe how it fails to work in service of anything but just institutional preservation. He's essentially saying, trust me, I was there.
Precisely. The understanding he wants you to leave with is that he lived within these systems where truth is constantly a tool. It's a lever to be pulled, not some shared civic baseline. He wants the reader to feel the full tension of that environment.
Okay, let's unpack this by grounding the book in its context. When we look at this specific geopolitical moment, where does Moscow X sit? It feels incredibly contemporary.
It is absolutely timely. The narrative is set very much in the wake of Russia's post-Crimea and post-Ukraine confrontations with the West. This isn't the Cold War. It's set right now in the age of sanctions, info warfare, and transnational finance.
So the plot isn't driven by simplistic ideology like East versus West. It seems to be driven by economic warfare and the hidden flows of wealth. That brings us to the underlying logic. What's the argument of power that anchors this plot?
What's so fascinating here is that the logical argument of the plot is anchored not in, say, a nuclear launch or some daring sabotage mission, but in incredibly detailed financial flows, sanctions regimes, deep intra-elite conflict within Russia. The book actually dedicates time to the mechanics of asset seizure.
Can you give us a concrete example of that economic detail?
Certainly. There are these highly specific details like an FSB figure seizing a cache of physical gold from a rival oligarch, and then all the subsequent legal and covert maneuvers, the shell companies, the intermediaries, needed to recover that asset. The plot focuses on the leakage in the global financial system.
That detail is so telling. The idea that the ultimate leverage is still raw, physical gold seized by an intelligence service. It suggests that beneath the digital surface, raw resource control is still the real source of power.
That's the logical underpinning. And this focus, it really determines the audience and the author's purpose. McCloskey is definitely targeting the kind of reader who values psychological depth and a grim realism, the Le Carre-style fans over, gadget-driven action.
His purpose, then, is persuasive. He's trying to convince these readers that modern espionage is structurally compromised, morally gray, and just inseparable from global finance. It's a systemic critique wrapped in a thriller.
And it works. It works because the novel's persuasive force is less about arguing a thesis outright and more about immersing you in a world where institutional incentives constantly push people toward operationalizing their own humanity.
Yeah.
And that often leads to betrayal.
Which brings us to the core story itself. Let's get into the summary portion to ground our conversation. What is the subject of Moscow X?
So the central operation is a CIA effort to compromise one of Vladimir Putin's private bankers. This is someone deeply involved in managing the illicit wealth of the Russian elite. The agency sets up a specialized unit for this called Moscow X.
And the cover story they use sounds delightfully odd.
It does. Their cover involves establishing an international horse buying and trading business. It's centered first in Mexico, and then it expands into Russia. The two main CIA officers on this are Sia and Max.
So they have to insert themselves into the Russian elite using this horse trading operation to get close to the banker. And this whole thing intersects with the agenda of Anna, who is maybe the most compelling character in the book. Who is she? What's her situation?
Anna is the private banker's wife, so she's right inside the target's life. But critically, she is also a covert SVR officer. That's Russian foreign intelligence. And to complicate it even further, she's the daughter of a victimized oligarch, meaning she has this deep, personal agenda to recover stolen family wealth. She's positioned perfectly to betray everyone around her.
So the subject is standard spy fare on the surface, but the execution, the detail, is where the book's credibility is really built. Let's talk more about that ethos, specifically how the author builds your trust.
McCloskey builds that credibility through these incredibly specific, granular depictions of CIA training and station culture. The source material points to details like Tier 1 target tradecraft exercises conducted in Virginia.
Okay, let's clarify that. When you say Tier 1 target tradecraft, are we talking about the high-level, specialized surveillance training? What does that realism achieve?
Yes, that's exactly it. It's the highest level of human source recruitment and surveillance evasion training, described down to the smallest detail of operational planning and comms security. Reviewers all say the tradecraft feels utterly authentic, often mundane, but always tense.
And that realism is what invites you to trust the deeply cynical portrayal of both the American and the Russian services. He earns your trust on the procedure, then uses that trust to deliver a much darker message about the institutions themselves.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because we shift to pathos, the emotional core. The emotional appeal comes from these three intertwined character arcs, Sia, Max, and Anna. The book uses their relationships as the primary tool of critique.
It's the complexity of their loyalty that generates the sympathy, isn't it? They're competing loyalties to lovers, to parents, to their agencies, their country. They're all pulling in different directions. It creates this profound empathy even when their choices are morally compromised. It reinforces that core theme that these systems weaponize human attachment.
That's the character-driven symbolism at work. Anna, caught between recovering her father's wealth, serving the SVR, and being married to the CIA's target, really embodies that fusion of money, family, and state power.
And the CIA characters Sia and Max are forced to pose as a loving couple for the cover. Their intimacy itself becomes a tool. They have to fake a relationship or maybe nurture a real one, knowing it's being operationalized by Langley.
It serves as this subtle, powerful indictment of institutions that view human bonds, romance, emotional needs as just another asset to exploit. It really makes you ask, if your deepest relationships are contingent on an operation, what's left of your real self?
You know, what really struck me about the structural analysis of this book was how the pacing itself is a key part of the author's argument. Speaking of structural critiques, that's exactly the kind of detailed analysis we aim for on our YouTube channel.
Absolutely. This kind of structural breakdown is exactly what we aim for on our YouTube channel, Mindful Moments. We offer AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques, all to inspire reflection and rational thought.
Let's move into that deeper analysis of the book's structure. Critics describe Moscow X as a slow burner, and that pacing feels like a rhetorical strategy in itself.
It absolutely is. The book spends its early chapters developing character backstory, situating you in the complexity of the operation, the training, the logistics, the emotional toll, before the action accelerates once they actually get to Russia.
Yeah.
This isn't accidental. The structure trains the reader.
It trains us to attend to nuance. You learn to expect shifting allegiances, institutional rivalries. It ensures that later reversals, the betrayals, the double crosses, feel completely earned, not just arbitrary plot twists.
And this patient structure is paired perfectly with a multi-perspectival narration style. The narrative is constantly alternating among different places. Langley, a small, dusty Mexican horse ranch, and the insulated, wealthy world of Moscow.
That structural choice is crucial. It forces you to inhabit not just the CIA perspective, but also the intense tensions inside the Russian elite and their security services. We see exactly why Anna is doing what she's doing.
It rhetorically dismantles any simple good West versus bad Russia binary. By giving us enough perspective, it argues that all sides operate within their own rationalities and their own equally deep institutional corruptions. The book forces you to abandon easy moral judgment.
The stylistic realism also powerfully contributes to this. Critics note the detailed descriptions of surveillance norms in Moscow, the constant feeling of being watched, cameras everywhere, and the fact that many in the elite accept this control in exchange for status and comfort.
And that functions as a quiet but devastating warning about how authoritarian structures are sustained. It's not just overt repression. It's sustained by these everyday, practical bargains, trading absolute freedom for comfort and security.
If we connect all this back to the initial premise, it raises that central problem of modern politics, the epistemic problem. When everyone is an operator and every relationship is conditional, what happens to the truth?
That is the core theme. The book repeatedly shows truth as contingent, as weaponized. Operatives mislead each other, not just the enemy. Agencies run these intense compartments where info is restricted, often contradictory, meaning no single person has the full picture.
When you say the epistemic problem, you mean the crisis of knowledge. How do we know what's real when every actor, every government is intentionally manipulating information?
Exactly. The book dramatizes this issue. When information manipulation is standard operating procedure for every intelligence service, knowing what is going on stops being a shared civic baseline and becomes a tightly controlled privilege.
The ultimate condition of modern espionage. The impossibility of certainty.
And this leads us to the final necessary critique the novel offers on global power. By foregrounding oligarchs, private bankers, and the complicity of Western institutions like law firms that launder Russian money despite sanctions, McCloskey points to a transnational elite that truly transcends national loyalty.
The rhetorical impact there is profound. It questions whether any side, Washington or Moscow, is genuinely serving ordinary people versus just serving entrenched, globe-spanning wealth.
Yeah.
It suggests the game is rigged at the top, regardless of the flag.
Now, as critical readers, we need to check one final point, the subtle fallacy at play. The novel generally avoids simplistic framings, which is good. But its main risk is a subtle appeal to authority.
That appeal being the suggestion that because the author was an insider, because he knows the tradecraft so intimately, his cynical view of these institutions must therefore be the definitive truth.
That's right. The critical reader has to hold that suggestion at arm's length. The author provides great information about tradecraft, but the understanding he pushes for is inherently skeptical. And while that skepticism is informed, it is not the only possible conclusion. We have to assess it critically.
So, what does this all mean for you as you engage with this complex thriller? Does Moscow X's portrait of institutions leave any genuine space for ethical resistance, or does the logic of inevitable betrayal, the institutional imperative, always win? That's the question for you to consider.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book summary. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.